In the waning years of the 19th century, a fever gripped the world. It wasn't a sickness of the body, but of the soul. A fever for gold. It drove 100,000 desperate souls north to the frozen, unforgiving wilderness of the Canadian Yukon. This was the Klondike Gold Rush, the last great stampede of its kind, a brutal, beautiful, and deadly chapter in human history. At the heart of this maelstrom lay Dawson City, a chaotic sprawl of raw lumber and mud-choked streets, carved hastily into the confluence of the Klondike and Yukon rivers. A city of 17,000 souls, it was a place of wild dreams and even wilder realities. Fortunes were won and lost in the turn of a card, and lives were valued by the weight of the dust in a man's poke. Saloons, crowded and chaotic, served as the lifeblood of the community, where men sought news, companionship, and a fleeting escape from the harshness of their lives. In this city of extremes, three figures moved in orbits destined to collide. The first was Silas Blackwood, a man carved from the Yukon's permafrost. He'd arrived with the first wave of prospectors and built an empire not on finding gold, but on controlling it, and the men who sought it. His hands were calloused, his justice swift, and his greed bottomless. He was the uncrowned king of Dawson, a predator who circled the weak, always sensing opportunity. The second was a woman known only as Eliza. In a town filled with outcasts, she was the most outcast of all. A prostitute in the town's rowdiest saloon, the Gilded Cage. She was a ghost at the feast, a silent fixture in a room of roaring men. They used her, mocked her, and discarded her, their drunken laughter echoing off the walls of her invisible prison. Her face, though still young, was a mask of weary indifference, her eyes holding secrets deeper and colder than any frozen creek. And the third, he was barely a man at all. Liam was a boy from a farm in the east, lured north by sensational newspaper headlines and the promise of a quick fortune to save his family's land. He was quiet, naive, and utterly alone. The brutal reality of the Klondike had stripped him of his youthful optimism, leaving only a hollow ache of loneliness. He was a loner in a city of loners, a whisper in a storm of noise. Our story begins where so many in Dawson did, inside the Gilded Cage. The air is thick with the stench of cheap whiskey, sweat, and unwashed wool. An out-of-tune piano hammers out a ragged tune, a frantic soundtrack to the desperate gambling and loud boasts of men who'd struck rich, and the quieter desperation of those who hadn't. In the corner, at a small scarred table, sits Eliza. Men approach her throughout the night, their intentions crude and clear. She meets their gaze with a deadened stare, a silent transaction of coin for a few moments of feigned affection. But then something different happens. Liam, his face still boyish and clean-shaven, approaches her table. He doesn't leer. He doesn't posture. He slides a small but significant pouch of gold dust on the table. Eliza looks at the dust, then at him, her expression unchanging, expecting the usual proposition. "For your time, but not for that. I'd just like to sit and maybe Maybe you could tell me a story about what it was like before all this." Eliza stares at him, a flicker of confusion in her guarded eyes. In the heart of the Klondike, a place built on taking, this young man was offering payment for something no one had ever valued: her voice, her history. He was the only man in the city who saw a person behind the reputation, and that single quiet act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would end in blood, betrayal, and the revealing of a secret worth more than all the gold in Dawson. The arrangement became a ritual. Twice a week, Liam would enter the gilded cage, his eyes scanning past the raucous card games and boisterous miners to find Eliza at her corner table. He would pay for her time, and they would talk. At first, the conversations were stilted, hesitant. Eliza's stories were guarded, simple anecdotes of growing up in a place with trees that weren't perpetually covered in snow. Liam spoke of his home, of the green fields and the feeling of soft earth under his feet, a world away from the frozen mud of Dawson. Slowly, a fragile trust began to form in the shadows of the saloon. He learned that her real name was Elizabeth, and she loved the smell of rain. She learned that he was terrified of bears, and that he wrote letters to his younger sister that he never sent because he was too ashamed of his failure. He was paying for stories, but what he was truly buying was a connection, a brief respite from the crushing isolation of the North. For Eliza, he was a window to a life she thought she had lost forever, a reminder that kindness could exist, even in the heart of greed. But their quiet sanctuary did not go unnoticed. Silas Blackwood missed nothing in his town. He watched the boy miner and the saloon girl with a cold, calculating curiosity. Eliza, to him, was not a person, but a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. He'd known her father, a prospector named Thomas, a stubborn old man who had vanished into the wilderness 5 years prior, rumored to have found a legendary strike, a riverbed that ran thick with gold. Silas was convinced Thomas had told his daughter his secret before he disappeared. For years he had tormented her, using threats, violence, and humiliation to try and break her spirit and claim the secret for himself. But Eliza had endured, her silence an unbreakable shield. Now, seeing her talk to this naive boy, Silas's suspicion festered. What was she telling him? What secret was she whispering in the one corner of Dawson he couldn't control? One evening, the tension snapped. Silas, drunk and emboldened by his power, strode to Eliza's table while Liam was away, panning his fruitless claim. He grabbed Eliza by the arm, hauling her to her feet. "Still holding out on me, are you?" he snarled, his voice a low growl that cut through the saloon's noise. "Think your little farm boy is going to save you? He'll be another frozen corpse by spring. But you'll tell me what your father found, one way or another." He shoved her, and she stumbled, falling hard against a table. The saloon fell silent for a moment, the patrons watching, before a few nervous laughs broke the tension and the piano player hesitantly resumed his tune. No one helped her. No one dared. Later that night, when Liam came for their scheduled talk, he found Eliza's chair empty. He saw the new dark bruise on her cheek and the way she flinched when the saloon doors opened. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He simply sat at her table, paid double, and didn't ask for a story. He just sat with her in silence, a silent promise of solidarity that was louder than any of Silas's threats.
From that day on, a shadow hung over them. Liam began to notice a change in Eliza. She was thinner, and a persistent rasping cough had rooted in her chest. The brutal Yukon winters, combined with the unsanitary conditions of the boomtown, and a spirit worn down by years of abuse, were taking their toll. Their talks became more urgent, her stories tinged with a new melancholy. She spoke more of her father, of his kindness, his obsessive belief in a hidden place, a sanctuary of gold where they could start over. Liam listened, his heart aching for the life that had been stolen from her. He was no longer just a lonely boy seeking conversation. He felt a fierce protective need to shield this broken woman from the cruelty of the world, unaware that he was already years too late.
The Klondike winter descended with a vengeance, a suffocating blanket of white that choked the light and life from Dawson City. Sickness, always lurking in the crowded and unsanitary town, began to claim its victims. Eliza's cough worsened, turning into a fever that left her weak and shivering in her small, drafty room, a crib as they were called, behind the saloon. Liam spent what little gold he had, not on whiskey or cards, but on medicine, blankets, and firewood for fighting a losing battle against the inevitable. One night, he found her barely conscious, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The end was near. He knelt by her cot, taking her frail, cold hand in his. The raucous noise from the saloon next door felt a world away, a vulgar intrusion on this sacred, final moment. "Liam," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. He had to lean in close to hear her. "He never found it, Silas. He thought he could beat it out of me." A weak, painful smile touched her lips. "But my father, he gave it to me, to keep safe." With trembling fingers, she reached up to the thin chain around her neck. Tucked beneath her worn dress was a simple, tarnished silver locket. She pressed it into Liam's palm. Her fingers were icy cold. "He was a good man," she breathed, her eyes glazing over with memory. "A dreamer. He found it, Liam. A place the old ones spoke of. A river of gold. But someone followed him. Silas. He killed him for it. For the map." Her grip on his hand tightened. A final surge of strength. "Silas has tortured me for 5 years, believing I have the map. And I do. Just not where he was looking." Liam looked at the locket in his hand, confused. "Eliza, I don't understand." "Open it," she commanded, her voice barely a whisper. He fumbled with the clasp. The locket sprang open. Inside, there was no portrait of a loved one. Instead, pressed into the hollow space, was a small, folded piece of cured leather, thin as parchment. "It's not paper," she whispered. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Ink would fade. He carved it into leather. A secret language of landmarks only we knew. The crooked birch, the sleeping bear rock. He made me memorize them." The weight of her secret, of her entire life's burden, settled upon Liam. This was why Silas had been so cruel, so obsessed. This was the prize he had been hunting. "He chose me," Eliza said, her voice fading. "He chose my kindness. A kindness for a kindness, Liam. Don't let the greed have you. Find it. And be free. For me." Her hand went limp in his. Her eyes, which had seen so much cruelty, finally closed. "Elizabeth," The woman who loved the smell of rain was gone. Liam knelt there, frozen in grief. The locket felt like a burning coal in his hand. He had a secret that could get him killed, a map to a dead man's dream, and the final wish of the only person in this God-forsaken land who had shown him any humanity. Suddenly, the flimsy door to the crib burst open, crashing against the wall. Silas Blackwood stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, his face a thunderous mask of suspicion. His eyes darted from Eliza's still form on the bed to the young miner kneeling beside her, and then they locked on to the silver object clutched in Liam's fist. "What is that?" he growled, taking a heavy step into the room. "What did she give you?" Grief morphed into a cold, primal fear. Liam scrambled to his feet, shoving the locket deep into his pocket. He was no fighter, no match for this brute. But as he looked at Eliza's peaceful face, something else ignited within him, a burning, righteous anger. "Nothing," he choked out. "She gave me nothing." Silas lunged. He was faster than a man his size should be. He grabbed the front of Liam's coat, lifting him effortlessly. "Don't lie to me, boy," he roared, his face inches from Liam's. "I saw it! Give it to me!" In that moment, Liam wasn't a naive farm boy anymore. He was the keeper of a promise. With a surge of adrenaline he didn't know he possessed, he kicked out, striking Silas hard in the knee. The big man grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Liam needed. He twisted free, knocking over a small table and a lantern, plunging the room into near darkness. He scrambled out the door and into the freezing alley, the sound of Silas's enraged roar echoing behind him. He ran, clutching the secret in his pocket, a lone figure disappearing into the labyrinthine, snow-dusted streets of Dawson City. He was no longer just a miner. He was a hunter, and the hunted. For 2 days, Liam hid in the sprawling, chaotic outskirts of Dawson, a ghost in his own life. He sold his mining tools for a pittance, using the money to buy a used rifle, dried rations, and a sturdy pair of snowshoes. Before he vanished, he performed one last act of defiance and respect. Under the cloak of a moonless night, he went to the makeshift cemetery on the edge of town, a field of frozen earth and crude wooden markers. He dug for hours in the iron-hard ground to give Eliza a proper grave, separate from the pauper's pit she was destined for. He marked it with a simple cross made from 2 pieces of driftwood. There were no words, no ceremony, just a silent promise whispered into the biting wind. Then he was gone. With the locket tucked safely inside his coat, he slipped out of Dawson and into the vast, silent wilderness of the Yukon. He knew Silas would be hunting him. He knew the chances of survival, let alone finding a mythical river of gold, were slim. But the map and Eliza's memory were a fire in his belly. He traveled by night, resting during the day in hidden shelters. By the weak light of his small campfires, he would study the piece of leather from the locket. It was not a map in the traditional sense. There were no lines of longitude or latitude. It was a series of symbols etched into the hide, a drawing of a birch tree bent by the wind, a cluster of rocks that looked like a sleeping bear, a creek that forked like a serpent's tongue. It was a story, a path to be read by someone who knew the language of the land. It was the last conversation between a father and his daughter, and now Liam was its sole inheritor. The journey was a brutal ordeal. He crossed frozen rivers where the ice groaned under his weight, climbed ridges where the wind threatened to peel him from the rock, and pushed through dense forests that seemed to swallow the light. Days bled into weeks. The naive farm boy was stripped away, layer by layer, by the relentless cold and hardship, leaving behind a core of hardened resolve. He found the crooked birch, its trunk permanently bowed as if in prayer. Days later, he sighted the ridge that from the right angle looked exactly like a sleeping bear. He was on the right path. Eliza's father had been a genius, creating a map that was meaningless to anyone who didn't have the patience to see the world through his eyes. Finally, after nearly a month of travel, he found the last landmark, a narrow canyon hidden by a recent rockfall, exactly as a symbol on the map had depicted. He squeezed through the opening, and what he saw stole his breath away. It was a small, sheltered valley cut off from the main river systems. A shallow creek snaked through it, and the banks, the creek bed itself, glittered. It wasn't just dust. It was flakes, nuggets, veins of pure, unadulterated gold woven into the very fabric of the earth. It was a river of gold, a king's ransom, untouched by human hands since the dawn of time. Eliza's father had not been dreaming. A wave of emotion washed over Liam. Grief, triumph, awe. He fell to his knees, scooping up a handful of the heavy, glittering sand. He had done it. He had honored her last wish. But his victory was short-lived. A voice, hard and familiar, echoed from the canyon entrance. "I knew you'd be good for something, boy." Silas Blackwood stood there, flanked by two of his hired thugs. He was gaunt, his face frostbitten, but his eyes burned with a triumphant, manic light. He had followed Liam's tracks, a patient predator stalking his prey. "The locket," Silas said, stepping into the valley, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "Hand it over, and then you can show me where the real treasure is." Liam slowly rose to his feet, his own rifle leaning against a rock just out of reach. He had come too far, endured too much to give up now. This was no longer just about the gold. It was about Eliza. It was about justice. "It's over, Silas," Liam said, his voice steady. "She beat you." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that desecrated the valley's peace. "She's dead. I won. Now, are you going to die easy or hard?" As Silas and his men advanced, Liam backed away towards the creek. He remembered Eliza's last fevered whisper, a story about her father's fear of the unstable ground near the river. A warning. He glanced at the creek bed, at the way the water seemed to bubble up from beneath the gravel in certain spots. An underground spring, unfrozen, unstable ground. He took a calculated risk. As Silas raised his rifle, Liam lunged, not for his own weapon, but sideways, throwing all his weight onto a patch of gravel near the water's edge. It gave way with a sickening lurch. Liam fell into the icy water, but the ground beneath Silas and his men, already weakened, collapsed into a sinkhole of freezing mud and slurry. They cried out in shock, their heavy coats and gear pulling them down. Silas fought, cursing and clawing, but the cold, hungry earth of the Klondike, the very ground he sought to conquer, claimed him for its own. Liam dragged himself from the water, shivering and exhausted, the sole witness to the end of Silas Blackwood. He was alone, in a valley of impossible wealth, finally free. But the gold fever had broken. He looked at the glittering creek, and he didn't see a fortune. He saw the cost. He saw a murdered father and a daughter whose life had been destroyed by this yellow metal.
He spent a week in the valley, gathering only enough gold to secure a new life, a small fraction of the immense treasure. He left the rest. He sealed the canyon entrance with rocks, burying the river of gold once more, letting it return to being a secret. Liam was never seen again in the Klondike. He traveled south, far away from the snow and the greed. He bought a small farm with green fields, just as he had described to Eliza. He lived a quiet life, a life of peace. He never forgot the woman in the saloon, the woman who had been despised by everyone, but who had given him the greatest treasure of all, not a map to a river of gold, but a lesson in the true worth of a human soul. And in his pocket, for the rest of his days, he carried a tarnished silver locket, a reminder of a promise kept and a kindness that had echoed longer and louder than the frantic cry of gold.